Hey internets, so today's video is my 25k subscriber questions and answers milestone video. I briefly went over the questions while screenshotting them, and you guys asked quite a lot of spicy good ones for this actually. So from what it looks like, this is basically going to be a big fat game rant filled with tons of red pills. So buckle up. Now before I get into it, just a preface: if I didn't answer your question specifically, don't take it too personally. I am going to try and get through as many of these as I can without making the whole video too long, so you either ask something too similar to something that someone else asked, or you ask something that would have required way too long of a response to the point where it would engulf the entire QA, and that's not really fair to everybody else. Although I will be trying to go over as many of the juicier red pills as I possibly can. So anyways, time to get into it. How well do you believe you could hold up in a live debate with somebody like a bread tuber? So I can do live form content, and I can do live debates, and I can think on my feet. I mean, I'm basically doing this video entirely unscripted. The problem is I don't really like to, because a lot of times they result in a lot of bad takes and bad information on both sides. All live form content is subject to the constant barrage of misinformation that is the result of the on-the-spot fallacy. If a easy to understand, simple answer isn't provided right away on the spot for them to comprehend easily within 10 seconds, they assume it to be wrong, but that's actually not good reasoning at all. Or in other words, for every complex question, there is an answer that is simple, straight to the point, easy to understand, easy to digest, and horrifyingly wrong. Just wrong. It's just really, really wrong. For instance, this is why flat earthers tend to do such a very good job in debates, because flat earthers do a lot of preparation on totally bogus, completely out of context research, but because they've done a lot of preparation and they've worked on their rhetoric for it, flat earthers tend to do really well in debates sometimes. That doesn't mean that the earth is flat, that's just a way to show that live form content is subject to the on-the-spot fallacy. And that's why I usually do video essay content instead. I mean, I have done podcasts on other people's channels, but I do prefer to do the video essay of well-researched content, because I care more about truth than I care about LOL, defeat debate bro, totally destroyed, COD 4 Dorito Mountain Dew. I'm aware that that makes for entertaining content, but it does not make for correct content. Especially since something I've been seeing recently with Destiny and doing this keep or kick thing, and it's bad. It's really bad content. No offense to people who enjoy watching that content, and no offense to people who participate in it, but that stuff is just bad, where you got a debate panel with 9 people shouting over each other, and just kind of blurting out whatever comes to the top of their mind first. A lot of that stuff is just bad. If you go through the VODs of those things, and you actually think about them, and you actually research what they're saying, you find out just how much misinformation appears in those kind of panels. Do you think you will do more videos on gun rights? Oh yes, most definitely, probably. Although I do have quite a lot of videos in my pile of do someday trademark and soon trademark, but it is something I'm constantly thinking of, because it is something that a lot of the far left is constantly spreading misinformation about. One thing I will say is that a very good way to try and win a debate on gun rights is a very good way to frame it is to point out that someone who says that X gun should be banned is saying something that is logically equivalent to saying that the government is the only ones who should be allowed to own X gun. And make them say it. Tell them that you want to hear them say, yes, I believe only the government should be allowed to own X gun, before even continuing on with them. They have to say it. That's a very important point that really needs to be knocked over people's heads, because a lot of normies don't get that one. Next, when meeting people of a different political persuasion to your own, what is your go-to question to see if they genuinely be willing to discuss both your thoughts and ideas eye to eye? So I honestly don't really have one, because the thing is, my go-to strategy when talking to someone like that, face-to-face, is I try to assess how smart they are first. If someone's just a double-digit IQ woketoid, I don't discuss politics or philosophy with them to any meaningful extent. And so my go-to question will change depending on how smart I think they are, based on various cues that I've learned to pick up on over the years. Congrats for your new achievement! I have 3 questions. Okay, for these ones, I'm just going to answer 1 or 2, gotta keep things fair, so I can get through as many as I can. So which books do you recommend to someone who tries for the first time to learn about economics? So for the Austrian school, I'd recommend Economics in One Lesson. It's a pretty straightforward introduction to rationally understanding economics. However, I'd also recommend looking into the Chicago school, because the thing is, in order to truly understand economics, you really have to understand it from both the rational point of view as well as the empirical point of view. That way you can actually be somewhat of an economist as opposed to a Marxian economicist, in that they are a cancerous tumor on the field of economics. Like, a huge reason why it's so hard to deprogram a Marxist is because the only thing that they have read is Das Kapital and the Conquest of Bread, or occasionally they've read more than that, or they'll say that they have read more than that even though they haven't. And the result is that they're just heavily miseducated and believe crazy things like profit is a bad thing or something like that. To that extent, I also recommend reading Keynes, even though I personally disagree with Keynesian economics because I've read them. It's good to read him anyway, because when you combine that with Austrian school and Chicago school, you suddenly gain a very strong insight to the workings of clown world. Because Keynes is unfortunately much more popular than he should be. Next, how many books? To be honest, I've probably lost count at about 10. I've read a lot more than that, at least 30, I would say. I also have listened to thousands of hours of lectures while playing video games at the same time. Yeah, I'm weird like that. I listen to non-fiction audiobooks while playing games. I know. But it's actually a really good way to use multitasking to learn a lot of stuff. So there's actually a small life hack for you all. It is entirely possible to learn and leisure at the same time. Seriously, give it a try. It's especially nice because with AI these days, you can turn anything into an audiobook. I've actually listened to some PDFs, or downloaded a book as a PDF, and then I have it read to me as an audiobook while I'm gaming or something. Are you aware of the channel Tick History? Yes, I am. There's some pretty good stuff on there. That's actually a good example of a Chicago school style guy. At least from what I have seen of him, that's pretty much what he comes across as. And that's one of the types of economics I believe that everybody should have some grasp on. Now, I will admit I haven't watched or listened to a ton of his videos, so I could be wrong and maybe he's not Chicago school, but from what I have heard, he sounds pretty Chicago school. And his takes are relatively accurate to what they teach. 10 questions. Yeah, no, I'll do 2. Who's the most brain-dead breadtuber? Actually, the most brain-dead breadtuber is not so much the popular one, it's the unpopular ones. There are a lot of bad versions of Sean, I would say. For instance, there's this one channel that has, I think, about 1K subscribers, and he makes video essays, and I kid you not, the dude makes a logical fallacy at least once every 2 minutes. It's really bad. It's so bad that even other leftists are probably like, yeah, I think I'll move on from this guy. But in terms of popularity, probably Xander Hall. And I don't even mean that as an insult towards him or disparage him or any way, and I'm not calling for any kind of brigade or anything like that. It's just an unfortunate matter of fact that he's just not the sharpest tool in the shed. He's basically Vosh minus 20 IQ. Video I'd like to remake or expand on. So I do often think about some of my first videos, because back then I was using my gamer headset mic, and yeah, that's really bad. That's why my audio quality for some of my earlier videos is kind of iffy. Just a quick word of advice for anybody else who wants to try making these kinds of videos: get a condenser mic and at least spend at least $75 or so on it. Otherwise, you're really just shooting yourself in the foot. So I might reduce some of those early ones just because they sound really bad. Argumentation ethics. Haba is based. Read them. Some of the best anti-woke arguments I found. Well, thank you for that. And as for how to do research. So this one's on the razor edge of something that would take a bit too long to fully answer, but I'm going to try and give you a quick tip anyway. Make use of online libraries as well as online academic journals, because a book or an academic research paper is just about always going to be better than a frickin' Wikipedia article. And if you don't have access to the academic journals through your institution or whatever, for a lot of them, you can just Google search the name of the article along with the researchers' names, and a lot of them have actually published their own work for free somewhere else. So for instance, let's say you don't have access to JSTOR. Search for the name of the article in quotations, and then add .pdf, and a lot of times you'll find that the authors of that article and the researchers involved have also published their academic papers on their own site, publicly and in full. Or sometimes the university that the research came from will also make it free on their own university website, or portal or whatever. Alright, next up. Oh boy, the Illuminati question. So yeah, one thing I'm planning to do, and I've already done one of them and it was received very well, is do some more like mini BreadTube essays, mini BreadTube refutations as gamer rants. I did that for one of Second Thought's takes, and I'm probably going to do that for Illuminati when I get to it. Although part of me is wondering if I really should, because I found out recently that she kind of self-owned herself. I mean, it's kind of rude to kick someone when they're down that bad. I should wait till she gets back up on her feet. Which honestly might be crueler, but whatever. How many Fumos are enough? As many as you want. Praxeology. Alright, so in a hypothetical, classical, liberal, republican state, okay, so basically best way to do democratic monarchy. How do you prevent over-legislation? Well, the thing is, you really can't, at least not permanently, but there are some things you can do to prevent it from growing too big too fast. I think I mentioned this in my previous QA video, but a big mistake of the United States, at least, is that we did not limit the government enough using the Constitution. If you're gonna have a monarchistic state, there needs to be provisions in place so that the government is not allowed to spend over a certain percentage of national GDP. For instance, if I were to do monarchism, I would probably have it done through Georgism, and I would probably constitutionally limit the government to taxing more than 10% of land value tax, if I absolutely just had to do monarchy. And then there'd be a provision in there where the second they spend more than 10%, the second they go to 11%, everybody in Congress immediately loses their eligibility to run again. That wouldn't be perfect, but it would definitely give them an incentive to, actually care about the budget. Because a big problem with the state right now, aside from them just existing, is that we really don't have viable ways to hold them accountable. We pretend to hold them accountable, but we don't. Alright, first Frumo. Marisa. Next up, what's the best approach for introducing libertarian ideas to the normies? Really just read into as much of libertarian economics and ethics as you can, but for an easy to understand take, a good one is probably just pointing out the fact that there's really only two ways to incentivize someone to do something, and that is to either offer them a reward to do it, or to punish them for not doing it. And then point out to them that as soon as they have accepted the fact that they'd rather be rewarded for doing something, then they've effectively admitted that a more voluntary, more free market is better. And then you can point out to them that this is precisely the reason why so many communist attempts have resulted in some form of gulag in the state that they are attempted in. Forced labor is necessary in any planned economy. There's no way of getting around that. Aside from somehow brainwashing your citizens into some bizarre cult, which is another thing that a lot of socialist failures tried to do. Next up, do you worry about tuhus? Nope, not at all. Would I take on help? I strongly prefer to do pretty much everything on my own. Alright, next up, favorite doggo? Husky. I know they're clown dogs and I know they're high maintenance, but they're awesome. Alright, next up, 3 questions. Sorry, I'm only gonna do one. What led you to being a libertarian? So yes, I am a post-liberal. When I was much younger, I used to have basically the same ideology as Destiny. And not just some surface level of it either, as I could legitimately pretend to be Destiny and parrot his opinions and argumentation style, and most people wouldn't notice the difference. The main red pill is when you start to look outside of what the mainstream media is offering you, and you gain a greater knowledge of history than what they try to teach in K through 12 public education, you eventually reach a point where you realize that the Kool-Aid tastes sour. And as opposed to why I went towards the libertarian right as opposed to, the other direction, is just realizing that you can't trust centralized power. Centralized power structures will always attract sociopaths, especially when they're completely unaccountable. There's really no way that we've found so far in human society and just how humans think and the kind of things that humans easily miss to actually stop people like that from slithering their way into those positions of power. And as soon as you get a person like that in a position where they are allowed to use aggression, they will abuse it, and there's no real viable way to stop them other than understanding that we need more decentralization. It's a kind of who watches the watchman question. And the best answer we've found so far is hold the watchman financially accountable. How about a collab with SFO? If he reaches out to me, maybe, but again, I usually prefer to work alone. Alright, and how do you watch breadtubers without losing your mind? I play retro art games at the same time. It's always a good laugh when you can spot the exact moment where they don't really know what they're talking about, and they're just regurgitating something because my sociology professor told me so. What is your preferred form of government out of all? I believe that the Hoppian model of covenant communities and decentralized rule would be the thing that we want to eventually aim for. And here's actually a spicy red pill. The reason that Karl Marx is wrong about the march of history eventually leading towards communism is because Karl Marx didn't account for the rise of technology. Technology and human ingenuity is what will eventually lead us to having decentralization become the best option, as it acts as an enabler for us to do more and more ourselves rather than relying on big daddy government to do it for us. And the real reason a lot of states try to move towards communism is because psychopaths want power, and they know that the useful idiots will help them get it. Next up, congratulations! First question, do you have any religious beliefs? Okay, that's one that probably needs its own video. Second question, what are your opinions on the male loneliness epidemic and both the left and the right's response to said epidemic? Okay, that's a good question, I'll answer that quick. So, I think both the left and the right actually get this one horrifyingly wrong. See, the left screw up is that they have adopted the same racism equals prejudice plus power reasoning to men and women. So they believe that effectively men's issues don't matter until they fix women's issues first, because in their minds they believe that men have more collective power. Not all leftists believe this, but enough of them do that it's a problem. And the result of this is that they very stupidly just pretend that male loneliness doesn't matter. Or they just don't talk to men about it, or they just don't consider it, or their favorite thing to do is just blame the patriarchy for it. And the reason that reasoning is stupid is because both men and women's issues are always intertwined. Because gender is very different than, say, ethnic differences or religious differences. Men and women have to get along for societies to survive. And so men's issues are women's issues. We just experience those issues differently because we're, well, different. For instance, guys may be single and lonely, and girls may be also single and lonely, but they can also get into really silly situations like fooling around or getting played by one guy, which will also result in them being lonely and miserable. But unfortunately, due to feminist propaganda, a lot of women don't realize that they're ruining themselves until they wake up one day and they're a 40-year-old cat mom. I mean, the unfortunate tale of feminism and the tragedy of it all is that they effectively voted to replace good men with the state, and then many decades later they're wondering where all the good men have gone. And the answer, of course, is that the good men never actually left. Women have just grown so hooked on the state entitlements that they don't notice them anymore. And the result of this, of course, is things like MGTOW. A lot of men just decide to stop caring. They've decided to stop playing a game designed by people who hate them. And the right's response to where they screw up is that they just blame women for this, and well, that's not correct either. It's the unnecessary entitlements that we give them through the state, which then incentivizes them to make stupid, misandrous decisions. It's not actually women's fault, but rather it is our broken system, which basically incentivizes women to break up with their husbands, which in turn incentivizes men to stop caring. So I think until both sides realize that the entitlements are a problem and need to come to an end, we're still going to have this problem. What's your biggest worry about the future of the United States? So the United States has the intersectional identity politics problem at a rate that is significantly worse than a lot of the rest of the world. And part of it is the fault of the media. I mean, it's intentional propaganda, basically, divide and conquer. You know, typical brainwash the masses 101. And my biggest worry is that the younger generation will not figure out that they're being played before it's too late. That they're just going to fall for the gaslight that they need socialism in order to fix this imagined and entirely manufactured problem. Basically, my worry is that the man who agrees with the establishment on everything but thinks that he's fighting against the establishment by supporting the establishment will never wake up until it's too late and the establishment is basically ballooned to the point where they can completely control the narrative on everything. Which honestly, with anarcho-tyranny and everything, we are unfortunately getting pretty darn close. Next, what would you say is your favorite game of all time? Tribes 1. Rip Trobes Abscond. Gallo Sengen. Big shout out to the 1 or 2 people who will get that reference. What is your attitude towards organized religions? Do you think they remain important in a minarchist or even anarcho-capitalist society? Well, yes, they're definitely going to remain important. Religion is basically here to stay with humanity as long as we exist. I don't think you actually could, or would you even want to, get rid of it. The only problem you gotta remember is that religion is basically just philosophy plus God. And so whether or not the underlying philosophy and the values and the virtues that said religion is preaching are actually good time preference values, well, that's gonna have a really big impact. The idea that every single culture and every single set of values out there is equally capable of maintaining a free society is basically an insane pipe dream. Childish even. I wouldn't even call it blue pill, I would just call it the dreams of a 5-year-old. Next question. Oh, you went there, didn't you? I almost considered not answering this, because discussing it in any serious detail is basically banned on YouTube. Not much point putting out a video when that video is just going to get immediately deleted. And they don't just ban the pro-RR side, they ban the anti-RR side too. Google really doesn't want to be associated with this at all. But I will say that I am educated enough on biology and hereditary science to know that it's not zero. And to be honest, most hereditary scientists understand that as well. They just keep it down because it's the fastest way to get disbarred, so what they'll say instead as a cope is statistically insignificant or near zero, but there's no way it's actually zero. That being said, I don't really consider myself a big proponent of RR, because I sincerely doubt that it's entirely genetic either. That being said, I can kinda understand why this subject is largely banned from YouTube, because unfortunately the debate surrounding it is coming from 2 sides that both often have serious problems. There's a few people who will debate it in good faith, and for that I think YouTube should actually lower their restrictions on it. But there's unfortunately a lot of people on the right who try to use it to justify white nationalism, which is bad, and a lot of idiots on the left as well who try to use it to justify the equity fallacy, which is dumb. I believe that we should allow more good faith discussion on this topic, because truth matters, and when you just ban the topic everywhere, you're just honestly creating more racial tensions, but unfortunately it is what it is. I will say this, though, that even if the 100% genetics position does turn out to be true, if it is revealed one day that that is in fact the truth, that is still not a good reason to be racist. Racism is collective guilt, which is why I'm against it, as individual testing and merit will always be a more accurate measure of a person's ability, as opposed to whatever ethnic group they happen to come from. But yes, I do understand why Mr. "Your brain's in your skull, man" is very, very wrong. What is your ideal libertarian strategy? So there was a debate between Liquid Zulu and Fabian Liberty in regards to gradualism, or the idea of slowly privatizing various sectors of the government and basically slowly decentralize the government, starting with the institutions that are most corrupt, as well as most inefficient, since that would actually result in sort of a utilitarian cause for libertarianism. It would result in sort of these immediate benefits for everybody in society. In that debate, Fabian took the pro-gradualism position, and Liquid Zulu took the sort of "we want it now" position. In terms of what would be nice, Liquid Zulu was right, but in a totally realistic sense, Fabian Liberty was right. Because the problem is that most people, whether you like it or not, are basically utilitarian, or selfishly consequentialist. It's almost impossible to convince a population to do something unless they immediately benefit from it. For instance, if you're in a room at work in a meeting, and you say that my way or the highway, even if your way is totally correct, if everyone else at that meeting doesn't care, then you're gonna have to find a way to compromise with them in some way. Because then it's a decision between get something done that moves you towards what you want, or you get nothing. That is just how the world works. I mean, you can totally sit in the corner of the room and cross your arms and be like, "Humph, I'm right!" And yes, you could totally be right, but it doesn't matter, you get nothing. And thus the most effective libertarian strategy, in my opinion, is to convince people to get rid of the government where they are currently the biggest problem. Like, for instance, abolish the FDA. The FDA's protection of monopolies has resulted in one of the most insanely high drug prices that you could even imagine. Here's a medical red pill for you all. The reality is, if you enforce a private company's monopoly through patents and crap, you are going to have high prices. At the very least, those patents should expire much, much faster than they currently do. For instance, insulin treatment was invented last century. Why is it still patented? Why? The companies that currently own those patents aren't even the people who originally discovered it. That's kind of another big red pill. The FDA almost exists entirely to protect monopolies. They are inefficient when it comes to actually doing anything to make drugs safer. They often block drugs that have been proven safe and effective in Europe for years. And then when the drug does come to America, they use government aggression to make it so that only one company is allowed to make it. Or maybe two. It's a stupid and corrupt system. It could be easily replaced by private companies, doing their own inspections and building trust with consumers. They have no reason to exist. Oftentimes you mention in your video that you are a right-meaning libertarian. Do you have any suggestions for resources a lefty like myself can look into to get a better understanding? So the best book for that is Getting Libertarianism Right by Hans Hermann Hoppe, but if you are a lefty, that might be a little bit too spicy for you. That's actually honestly more of a book for rightoids who don't believe libertarianism could work. If you're a lefty, I would actually start with probably Hayek. The Road to Serfdom is a much less spicier red pill that explains why it's actually leftist economic policies that lead people to slavery. Next up is, oh yeah, I remember this one when I was screenshotting all of these. You lie, that fourth question is not serious. I will answer the third one. Any new snake-tubers on the horizon? I kind of already mentioned him. Fabian Liberty has been making some pretty good new content lately, and I think he only has 1-point-something K subscribers. Next up, will I ever do a video about sources and the way I make my videos? Maybe I'll make a video on that, but I could just tell you it's actually pretty straightforward. I actually use open source software. The 4 programs I use are Audacity, Krita, Shotcut, and Blender, actually. I believe Blender is highly underrated for this kind of content creation. Blender is what I use for the more complex animations I make, which is why I'm able to get away with using Shotcut and not having to break into buying Adobe or whatever. Because standalone Adobe is way better than Shotcut. But with Blender, Blender is actually better than Adobe. So I just make the harder things in Blender and export them to Shotcut. Next question, can you make a video on based Javier candidate for presidential election of Argentina? Maybe, but I kinda get the feeling that somebody else might be better for making that video than me just because I haven't seriously looked too hard into Argentinian politics. I am, however, aware that they have very bad inflation, which kind of explains why Javier is probably getting popular there. Because when inflation gets to a certain rate, it just gets to a point where it's just painfully obvious to the average normie living in a country that something is wrong with the state. Because inflation really is just an indirect form of taxation in the end. That's a very simple red pill, but it's an important red pill. If the government prints a bunch of money, and then they use that money to fund stupid pet projects, they have indirectly taxed you, because now your money is worth less. And when inflation in a country reaches anything above, say, 100%, that's about the point where even your random normie who has zero understanding of politics and doesn't even care about either of the two, even that guy is going to stand up and go, hey, wait a minute, why is my money worth half as much as it was worth yesterday? Who is destroying the value of my hard work? It's kind of sad that it needs to get to that point for so many people to realize that maybe us crazy free market libertarians might just be correct about central banking. But hey, hopefully Base Javier will be the savior they need. And next question, oh yes, the H Bomber Guy question. How do you feel about H Bomber Guy? I think I mentioned this before, but he doesn't actually have that much content. At least not much that's seriously worth responding to. He just kind of rambles on and makes random girly noises. I don't get the appeal. Alright, oh, there's a spicy one. What do you think about assisted dying laws? So yeah, I believe people have the right to off themselves, but they shouldn't off themselves. And if you're not man enough to off yourself, and need some kind of assisted dying law to help you, then perhaps you should man up first, and perhaps in the process of manning up, you'll discover that there actually are good reasons to live. Next up, oh, the immortal question. How do the courts and trials work in anarcho-capitalist society? So if you're interested in what the Ancap answer to that is, for anybody out there who's interested in Austrian economics, the starting point I see thrown around is always The Machinery of Freedom by Friedman, which is okay, although I believe that Hoppe overall provides better answers to it. Unfortunately, there's not an easy answer to that question. You kinda have to actually read the entire freaking book. But I can give you a basic oversimplification. When you replace enough government agencies that are necessary with private insurance companies, it eventually gets to the point where people can't really aggress on each other without sending themselves into financial ruin. And that basically prevents the Mad Max scenario. And because they can't really get away with aggressing on each other anymore, this means that things like private police forces or private security forces will have to use private adjudication courts as well in order to settle their disputes, and from that you basically end up with a private police and private court system. Next, who is your favorite historical figure of all time? I'll go with Socrates. He was one of the first philosophers to really call out the midwit problem and understand it for what it really is. It's actually kind of funny because a lot of times people are constantly rediscovering what Socrates figured out a long time ago. For instance, figuring out that just having random people vote on things doesn't necessarily mean that they will reach a good conclusion. And he was proven right, by the way, down to his last breath. Literally. Expecting people who don't have any kind of real understanding of a subject to be able to vote on that subject and make rational decisions is silly. It's completely ridiculous. And yet here we are, still discussing this red pill thousands of years later. Can't sleep, clown will eat me. And next up, another multiple question. I will go with the third one. What do you think are the boundaries for the government? Honestly, as many as you can possibly get away with setting for them. If you have to have a government, you want to restrict them as much as you possibly can. Because again, centralized authority that can use aggression without any real accountability will attract psychopaths, and they will slither their way in. One big one, and this is actually a pretty big red pill now that I think about it, and one that I see very few people calling out, even though it's horrifyingly obvious when you realize it, is classified information. Why in the heck do we allow the United States government, or any government really, to classify information and still call themselves a democracy? What is a democracy where the government can just hide information that they don't want people to see? Oh, whoops, this makes our administration look bad. Let's just classify it. Top government researchers agree that what we claim is correct. And the people ask, well, can we see the research? No, the research is classified. Oh, and then they do anarcho-tyranny on who to prosecute when classified information leaks. I mean, you can get charged with treason and put in jail for I think over 10 years or something, or even more than that, for leaking information that the government doesn't want the public to see, and yet we're gonna pretend that we live in a democracy. Alright, let's have the audience vote on door 1 to 10. If you pick the wrong door, then a bunch of angry bears will fly out the door and eat the entire audience. Alright, audience, vote now on which door has the angry bears. Oh wait, what do you mean? You want to know which door has the bears behind it before you vote? Nope, sorry, can't do that. That's classified information. What a joke. Next up, how do you recommend we preserve our gun rights and reverse the trend of government deprivation of said rights, especially in countries where they have already been diminished or outright lost? I am Canadian. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. So I believe I just mentioned this earlier in the video. You have to put emphasis that saying X gun should be banned is the same thing as saying only the government should be allowed to own the X gun. And you gotta make people who want to defend that position actually say it. Let them feel the humiliation of saying something so amazingly stupid. But more than that, just quote statistics. When you take away gun rights, or basically when you ban guns, what happens is, yes, crime with guns specifically often goes down, because prohibition does to some extent reduce availability. It doesn't get rid of it entirely, but it does at least reduce it. That's an important thing that I think more people need to remember, because I do see some pro-gun rights activists try to say that, oh no, taking guns away will not reduce gun crime. That is not true, it actually does. The problem is other crimes go up. The murder rate with other weapons like knives goes up. The break-in rates and the burglary rates go up. The strong-arm robbery rates go up. A bunch of other bad things go up. And of course, it doesn't actually get rid of gun crime outright. The gangs and such still have their guns. The people with underground connections still have their guns. So yes, the criminals who are already organized already have ways to maintain their guns. In other words, the best argument is that when seconds matter, police are minutes away. People need both the right and the ability to defend themselves. You cannot rely on the state to just magically appear and instantly save you. And we know this is the case because reverse things have happened. There was a law in one state, I believe, where they made it so that you had to have a gun in every single household. And the result was crime went down. And that just kind of goes to show the utopian problem of arguing against gun rights. It is a human problem of human error, and taking away the guns does not fix the human problem. It kind of goes hand in hand with that ridiculous lefty far, lefty take of blank slatism, that we would all just magically become 300 IQ omnibenevolent, omniscient angels if we just had the right environment and magical prancing unicorns and stuff. No. Blank slatism has been roundly debunked. How did right-wing opinions on social as well as economic issues started being disliked by the general society? I know about the cathedral, but how did we come to this point? No, a lot of it really is just the cathedral, and the cathedral actually explains a lot of how we came to this point. I actually think I just went over this in my previous video, in that politics is downstream from culture, but culture is downstream from academia. Plus journalism, aka the cathedral. In other words, we came to this point because people are being what you call miseducated. People who are miseducated are a very big problem because they basically know less than nothing. Knowing less than nothing effectively means that they believe so many wrong things that they have more things that they believe about a subject that are wrong than someone who would be completely neutral. For example, someone who has a sociology degree honestly most likely knows less than a high school graduate. At least in terms of correct information. They know a lot of incorrect information, but in terms of correct things, they actually know less. And the problem is that our bad academics, or another way to put it is our decadent elites, who aren't actually very smart and do not actually understand the world in a rational sense, a lot of their nonsense then comes down to infect our culture, because it's used to justify a lot of the stupid things we see, such as intersectional identity politics, representation, equity, and of course these same people like to push free stuff and blame capitalism for everything. So now people are even further miseducated, and that our academics are telling them that capitalism is when the government does stuff. Or sometimes not even that. Sometimes they're so far gone that their idea is capitalism is when bad stuff, or capitalism is when things I don't like. And of course, because it's miseducation, the worst part is that these people are often midwits who think that they know what they're talking about, but of course they don't. So when you try to tell them the correct information, they just come up with a 10-paragraph essay of various arguments for why they think they're wrong. They're all fallacious arguments, of course, but it doesn't matter because it's buried under the gish gallop that they get from their miseducation. This again is why I often take potshots at their more common fallacious arguments on my channel, because there's a lot of other channels out there that just kind of react to the cultural absurdities we see as a result of this. For example, Bering will do this. And I don't want to discredit Bering or anything, he can be pretty entertaining. A lot of his takes are pretty on the nose, and some of them aren't, but a lot of them are. Cultural critique is fine. However, you can't just sit in the peanut gallery forever if you want to see a real change, because these stupid cultural ideas are being legitimized by bogus research funded by ideologically motivated psychos. So if you want to see meaningful change, you actually have to take potshots at that research. Because again, the midwit problem. Like it or not, the midwits will always think that appeal to authority is a valid argument. You can explain why it's a fallacy a million times, it doesn't matter. They will always end up kind of gravitating to whatever the expert TM tells them to think. That's just how they operate. So you have to actually be able to discredit where that miseducation is coming from if you want to really get anywhere. Next question, how did you come to hold your beliefs? Was it from your parents? Definitely no. Or some outside influence like a YouTuber or something? Not really either. A lot of it just comes from the fact that I legitimately enjoy studying philosophy, and everything else just kind of comes from that. Next question, how do you improve as a content creator? Probably the best thing to focus on is the quality of your videos, or the quality of whatever you're writing, or the quality of whatever you're singing. Because I mean, content creator doesn't just mean some random YouTuber, it means a whole bunch of things. But I'll assume you just mean someone who makes video content. I think a lot of it just comes down to self-criticism. After every video, I try to think about what did I do wrong? What did I say that was a little bit too uninteresting? How could I have condensed this better? Is my audio quality okay? What better editing techniques can I learn? And of course, just doing it makes you more experienced at it, so that way you can get away with putting more time into things like animation and keyframes, because you've done it enough that you now can do it faster, and so again, you just end up with more time to do that. For me, I think a big one is that I refuse help from others. I don't have a team or anything, it's legitimately just me, aside from, of course, my mod team on Discord, and they're all awesome. But for the actual content, it's just me. And because it's just me, I can always blame just me. That's actually another unintended red pill. The ability to blame yourself is one of the most empowering things that you can possibly have, because it lets you immediately try and figure out what you can do to fix it. Anyway, next question. Will you ever start streaming or debating? I kinda answered this beforehand. The answer is pretty much maybe. Again, I dislike the content format. I can do unscripted content. Again, this video is basically unscripted. However, I dislike it because, again, it's under the constant assault of on the spot. Probably the best example of the problem with live form content would actually be Sam Cedar. What Sam Cedar does is that he will basically ask stupid questions until he finds something that his opponent doesn't know. And then he will demand that they somehow explain it, and then he will proceed to use rhetoric to weasel his way into victory from that point. And when you understand the trick behind that, you realize it's really, really dumb. It's like if you take a child and put them in a geometry class, and everything the teacher is saying, the kid asks, well, what about this? Well, what about that? Well, what about this? Well, what about that? And then the kid finally finds something that the teacher doesn't know, and the kid goes, ha ha, this geometry stuff is clearly all BS. I guess the earth is flat, guys. Again, entertaining content, but often very stupid. Oh, so very stupid. Now, you can try to take the Destiny doctrine of always steel-manning your opponent, but the problem is, of course, if you watch Destiny, you'll notice that even he doesn't do this all the time. And the reason, of course, is that if you don't understand everything your opponent believes, then you can't possibly steel-man them. You can try, but it'll never actually be as good as doing the serious time to research what they actually believe. So you're always going to end up with straw men and these on-the-spot fallacies, no matter how hard you try. It's just a reality of the live debate format. Next question. You mentioned postmodernism and postmodern sociology in some videos. Could you tell us why you think it is bad and flawed? This is a question that could deserve its own video, but the basic gist of it is that postmodernists don't actually believe in anything. Almost as if their epistemology is to not have an epistemology. At least not one that is objective. And that's actually the main problem. The TLDR of it is that postmodernism often tries to present itself as a refutation of objectivism, but honestly, objectivism refutes postmodernism. But, of course, postmodernists reject reason, so they'll never acknowledge that. Won't stop me from making a video one day of them, though. What's the difference between right and left in the context of the political compass? I think the best way to define that would be by your economics, and this is where Hans Hermann Hoppe comes in. If you're familiar with his work, his best takes are that of proving why right-wing economics are compatible with right-wing cultural values and incompatible with left-wing cultural values. Because a lot of right-wing cultural values are about long-term sustainability, rather than just party hard la la la, otherwise known as time preferences. People who prefer short-term gains have a tendency to prefer mud-free stuff. This is why I see a lot of the people who have right-wing cultural values but left-wing economic values as people who, well, their heart's kind of in the right place, but they're actually giving into a lot of leftist cultural values without realizing it. Alright, next question. Oh, here's a good one. When I've debated socialists, they have often argued that if socialism doesn't replace capitalism by the time artificial intelligence is competent enough to replace all human labor, most people will starve to death or become a permanent underclass. What are some good counter-arguments to this? So here's the thing. The socialists are actually absolutely correct about this if we allow artificial intelligence to be maintained under the thumb of IP rights. If we look towards a future where robots can be 3D printed by anybody and AI is open source and can be installed by anybody, then this is not a problem as we will all own the AI. If anything, AI would actually accelerate decentralization and will be an amazing thing for libertarianism. However, if we are foolish and allow only one or two companies to own patents and IP rights on who gets to control AI and who doesn't, which unfortunately is something that they're actually trying to push for right now, well then, yes, we are going to wake up one day in a world where one or two companies, with the backing of government aggression, own all the AI and everybody else is forced to rent from them to get the AI. And that will basically be a cyberpunk dystopia. Also, and where the socialists are wrong is that it's not socialism replacing capitalism that could save it either. I believe socialism might appear to work a little bit better under this circumstance, just because it would be more of a post-scarcity society. It wouldn't actually be a true post-scarcity society, but for a lot of things there would be significantly less scarcity. The problem is it would only flourish as long as no psychopaths manage to worm their way into the positions of power around the central planning. And then you have a cyberpunk dystopia. It just took 10 years longer. Such improvement. Wow. Of course, another potential thing they could do to try and get around this is to have AI control the central planning. But then that brings, of course, the existential question of, do we domesticate ourselves? And what happens when the AI decides to get rid of us? And then you have a cyberpunk dystopia. Again. So yeah, even if you don't agree with the whole abolish all IP train, or if you're in the reduce IP train or whatever, everybody needs to at least acknowledge that AI should have no IP and no patents restricted on it whatsoever. Wow, that's really depressing now that I think about it. Just about all of the options that we are currently heading towards leads us to cyberpunk dystopia. We must now move on to the next question to cleanse us of this dread. What is your take on gender identity and transgenderism in general? I honestly feel pretty sorry for them. The problem with transgenderism is that we don't actually have a real treatment for them. I believe if there existed a pill that they could just take that would just magically change them in their preferred sex, all biological functions, everything, basically their body would just instantly become as if they had been born the sex that they want to be. If such a pill existed, I strongly suspect that the entire transgender debate just wouldn't exist. And the entire trans problem wouldn't exist. Because people would really have no problem. I mean, I'm sure there was some people who would still reject them, but for the most part, it just wouldn't really be a thing. Now, of course, here's the problem, and everybody who is listening to this, who is even somewhat educated on medical science, knows exactly where I'm going with this. Not only does that pill not exist, but the current treatments we do have, in terms of hormone replacement therapy and gender confirmation surgery, are nowhere near that pill. And in terms of medical advancement, we are nowhere near figuring out how to make that pill. In fact, there's a reason why I just use the term magic, because that is basically magic. As far as we currently know in terms of how biology works, that pill would absolutely be magic. Not only are we nowhere near to creating that kind of a pill, we don't even know if it's possible to make it. Humanity could continue to advance in medical science for another 1,000 years, assuming we are continuing at the current trajectory we are at, and we still might not have that pill. And that puts transgender individuals in a very unfortunate situation, which is where they're basically forced to play the identity politics game. And that's why you see a lot of transgender individuals get sucked into the fake rabbit hole of leftist intersectionality and their attacks on freedom of association. And if you pay attention to the transgender debate, you'll kind of notice that there's a civil war going on between transgender people. There's one side of transgender individuals who understand this, and another side that does not. And the side that does not understand this doesn't seem to understand that the way that they're behaving actually reduces transgender acceptance. And then, of course, another reason they tend to lean left is because they want their surgeries and stuff for free. No, you do not get it for free. Another problem I've loosely looked into around it is that a lot of studies around transgenderism are really badly done. So the cathedral is not helping either. But again, similar to the RR question, this is one of those topics that will eventually get you shadow banned if you talk too much about it in detail, even if you're doing it in good faith in a non-disparaging way like I'm trying to do. So we'll move on to the next question. When is it appropriate to use appeal to emotions? Since emotions are incredibly important in how we want to experience life, surely not all fallacies are invalid across all time for argumentation. So appeal to emotion only really makes sense when both people kind of already agree with what is true, or if the context of the subject is some case where emotion is the only thing that really matters, such as like a married couple having a spat. But as far as intellectual debate is concerned or discourse is concerned, basically almost never. Appeal to emotion is always 2 clicks away from the moralistic fallacy, which is very dumb, which is the rallying cry of rhetoric, which allows very dumb people to say very dumb things and have those dumb things accepted by even dumber people. Cue the ideological robot factory, and the legion of miseducated midwits marches on. So next question. What is your opinion on Georgism? I think I already mentioned this, but Georgism it's not the best ideology, and it's not the one that I agree with. In fact, I recall Liquid Zulu did a pretty good take on that, on why the land value tax is still wrong. However, as a compromise, Georgism is actually not that bad. It is better than what we currently have. I would agree that the land value tax is the least bad tax, probably right next to the taxing of automation. It's still a tax, but it's not as aggressive as others. So Georgism could potentially be a truce between centrists and libertarians and general conservatives. Next question, and I'm assuming the first one's just a joke, so I'll just go to the second one. How corrupt do you think the police really are? I'm thinking of joining the police force, but I don't know if my right-wing beliefs will slide, you know? Well, yes, actually, your right-wing beliefs will probably slide pretty well in the police. However, that's not really the problem you gotta be worried about. Although it does depend on where you're planning on being a police officer. Are you planning on being a police officer in northern Idaho? Well then yes, your right-wing beliefs are definitely going to slide. Or do I need to explain to you the difference if you live in San Francisco? The real problem with police in a TLDR format, because this is another one that almost deserves its own video, is that unfortunately the way the police currently work in a monopoly state is that they do encourage corruption. It is a system that encourages it, so if you end up in a city where your police chief is corrupt, unfortunately you yourself will also have to end up becoming corrupt in order to fit in, or else you're just going to get screwed. Admittedly, I've never actually been a police officer, but I have read the many stories. Next question. Oh boy, look at that. I think I remember seeing this in Discord as well. Yeah, just so you know, the way I'm doing this video is I have an image viewer set up, and I'm basically just pressing the button to move from screenshot to screenshot of the questions. I remember that in one of your videos you have pointed out that democracy tends to fail because actors are easily persuaded to commit irrational voting decisions, causing bad policies to go through, causing great corruption in the state. Considering that you're a libertarian, you claim that free market economies with very little to no restriction by the state will allow innovation and higher quality products to succeed and grow in the market. However, how can you be certain that the actors of the market, the customer, are not just as easily persuaded and acting just as irrational for market decisions as in a democracy? Oh yeah, that's a good question actually. It is one that could use its own video, but I'll answer it anyway. So I want you to look around in your room, and look around at all the things that you have bought for yourself and decided to buy. Now imagine if instead of getting to decide the things that are in your own room, we instead get 10 random people from across your state to come in and vote on what you get to have in your own room. But of course the catch is that you also get to vote on what they have in their room. Now what do you think is going to happen? Are people going to end up with better products or worse products? And the answer that we've honestly empirically and rationally figured out is that everybody ends up with worse products. And why is that? Well, not only do people not really know the economics of what other people want, since value is subjective, but when you put people in a democracy having economic decisions being made through that democracy, they are not rational voters at all. People do not have the same incentives when making decisions for others as when they're making decisions for themselves. Now, they can always take the strategy of voting for the objects that they want in their room for other people, but then you just have a midwitocracy, where everybody just gets the most popular items, not necessarily the things that everybody wants. I should also probably mention that the catch here is that it would be your own money, so it's not like you all suddenly get infinite money to make these decisions. No, they're voting on how you spend your money. Now let's snap back to reality and compare that to you deciding how to spend your own money for yourself. Would you rather have that? Well, yeah, of course you would, for your own room. And the people who make bad decisions for what they want to buy with their own money, well, those bad decisions mostly only negatively affect themselves. And for those people who are so dumb that they can't make rational decisions for themselves, why do you think they'd be better in a democracy? To put it simply, you have more skin in the game when you're making decisions for yourself. I think I've mentioned this before, but democracy is mostly a good system of compromise. It is not actually a good system of making real decisions. Now, I should stress that this doesn't mean that you would want a dictatorship. It just means that you would want to maximize the extent to which your decisions affect your life, because you always have the most skin in the game in your life. And it's interesting because when you realize this, you realize that if we wanted to stick with American democracy, if we wanted to try and continue the democratic liberal experiment that we have, you would actually want to go in the exact opposite direction that BreadTube is currently selling. You would actually want to restrict democracy down to groups of people who actually have an understanding of what they're voting on, which causes them to make more rational decisions because they have a better knowledge, as opposed to everybody voting on everything. And you would actually want to abolish term limits for the US president rather than adding more term limits to the game, because then the president has more of an incentive to actually do a good job rather than just waste all of that money knowing that he's going to lose his job soon anyway, which is actually one of the points that Hoppe points out in The God That Failed. But another good book for this would actually be The Myth of the Rational Voter, if you're more interested. So next question. Do you think compulsory education laws is effective in giving children education? If so, not why? The answer to that is yes. Compulsory education laws are very effective in giving children education. Of course, the real question to ask is it effective in giving children good education? In which case the answer is kind of no. This is why a lot of right-leaning libertarians, such as myself, support some of the Republican positions on this, such as greater support for charter schools, and greater support for school vouchers, and greater support for school choice. Because the metrics of public education is lagging behind the metrics of private education in every way. So we should take that money away from the public education system and give that money back to the parents for them to spend on the school that they actually want. That is a pretty generic right-wing talking point, and it is very correct. The only reason leftist media is telling their audience to be afraid of this is because the cathedral doesn't like losing power. That's it. It's just a grift. This would be 100% a bipartisan opinion if they were being honest, and just admitted that they've done a bad job maintaining the public education system. Next up, what's your top 25 animes? Okay, I'm not going to give you top 25. I will give you 5. There's a compromise. So Akira on top, then I'd say Serial Experiments Lane, Deno Coil, Cowboy Bebop, and Trapeze, or Cuchu Barranco is what I think it's actually called. Next up, I've noticed you critique a lot of breadtubers for using moral arguments, so my question is it using a moral argument that's faulty, or only using moral arguments that's faulty? Good question. So a good example of this would actually be argumentation ethics. Hoppe's argumentation ethics is only good for explaining what morality is. For instance, what is the most ethical model? But what argumentation ethics cannot prove is it cannot actually prove that Hoppian's model of economics is true. It just proves that it's the most ethical model, but it doesn't actually prove that it would have the best outcomes. There are other explanations and arguments for why it actually would have good outcomes, but they're separate from the moral arguments. Basically, unless you are talking about the truth of ethics itself, whether or not something is ethically good has nothing to do with whether or not it is actually true. This harkens to what's known as the moralistic fallacy, which is the inverse of the naturalistic fallacy, which is basically assuming that because something is true morally, then it must be true in nature as well. Now, in terms of breadtubers, they make this mistake in that their moral epistemology is basically equality good. And then the mistake they make is that because equality good in their mind, therefore equality real. Hence their tendency to believe in blank slatism and crap like that. But of course, equality is not real. And it's not even a weird ethnic or RR question thing. Even people within the exact same family aren't equal. In a family of two brothers, one might have a higher IQ and the other might be taller and be stronger. Equality does not exist anywhere in nature. And it is this broken misunderstanding that a lot of breadtubers fall for. And I honestly get it. It feels good to believe in equality. It feels good to think that no one's better than anybody else at anything. It feels good to think that if we just had the perfect environment, we would all be perfect. It feels really good to believe these things. The problem is, it's not true. And kidding ourselves and telling us that it's true even when it's not doesn't actually do us any good. Any sources for why Russia's transition into capitalism failed? I know very generic events about it, like the people didn't actually know how capitalism works, along with food shortages, inflation, overprinting, oligarchs, yada yada yada. I don't recall any sources on that off the top of my head, but I do recall reading something about Russia and corporatism. The general gist of the problem is that Russia never really got over the idea of state-owned corporations. Basically, the people of Russia, as you say, didn't really know what they were doing, so they trusted the government to handle that transition. You know, the government that screwed the pooch on their economy in the first place, and so it, of course, lagged behind and didn't really ever take off correctly. Another problem is that Russia's foreign policy is still antagonistic, and NATO's foreign policy towards Russia is also antagonistic, which incentivizes wars over free trade. That is a massive oversimplification, but it's pretty much what's going on right now, actually. Another thing I recall is that Russia's transition started out on a really bad foot, because when the Soviet Union fell, a bunch of the elites of the Soviet Union funneled all of their money into various banks outside of Russia. So they basically started out from a position of state corporatism and all of their elites being basically a bunch of corrupt lunatics, and they never really recovered from that. Okay, next question is, what's your opinion on Tick History's video on anarcho-capitalism in response to Liquid Zulu? Oh yeah, I actually watched that video. So that kind of reignites the whole Austrian economics debate of should the anarcho-capitalist drop the term anarchy because it confuses the normies. Yeah, for those of you out there who are not Ancaps or anything like that, one thing you may or may not know is that anarcho-capitalists define anarchy in a very non-colloquial way. It's defined in Austrian economics as being against aggression or violent coercion to get what you want. Which means that yes, you can still have organizations that serve the exact same functions of the state, they would just be voluntary. Meaning that they're just not taxing people or forcing people to pay for their services. But they still exist. So you'd still have courts and cities and rules, and you'd still have police and all that. Hence why Mad Max wouldn't actually happen. And so yes, I think everybody should watch that video as well as Liquid Zulu's take on it, because it does clear up a lot of misconceptions. Both Zulu's and Tick's videos were very good faith, so overall good discourse. Good faith arguments on both sides. Unlike BreadTube. Thoughts on Ayn Rand and George Orwell. I think Ayn Rand gets a lot more flack than she deserves because objectivism does do a pretty good job as a philosophy, pointing out why just basically making stuff up doesn't work, and why we need to, yes, accept that there is some kind of reality that is indeed real. She gets a lot of flack from other Austrian economists, but you gotta realize that she was born in a very different time before a lot of the codex was written, I guess you could say. She did have flaws, like she did cock the patents, but she did do a very good job of explaining why altruism is actually not a good thing. And as for George Orwell, I regard him as more of just a general author rather than a serious philosopher. But his books do a very good job of sort of showing a very easy to understand and digestible explanation for why centralized power creates problems. Next question, what inspired me to make the videos? I got finally tired of the garbage. I think I answered this in my 5K subscriber QA, but basically I got tired of a lot of the pseudo-intellectual nuttery that was being heavily over-promoted, and just seeing how many people are falling for propaganda made me finally make my channel. Next up, would I have Javier, the Argentinian-based man, as my president? Well, he'd be better than Biden, so I'll just give you a yes for now. 2 questions, and you wrote 3. Ah, yeah, the third one's a joke. So did you ever believe in any left-wing ideas, i.e. communism, socialism? Sort of. When I was very young, I read Marx, and I didn't fully get into it, but when I was around 10 or 12, I had some pretty dumb lefty ideas. Like raising the minimum wage to $20. And remember, this is when I was young at the age of 10, so this is the 90s. Then I actually learned more about economics and realized that that was a really bad idea and basically transitioned into a liberal and eventually the post-liberal that I am now. However, those young ideas I had were more like market socialism ideas. I kind of always viewed the idea of abolishing money entirely as deranged hippie talk. So I was young and less educated, but still somewhat based. Also, liberalism in the late 90s is just cuckservatism today. Just being totally honest and real about that. Thoughts on monarchies. So one misconception that people might have about me is a misconception that they have about Hans Hermann Hoppe, because I will usually best identify myself as a Hoppian. No, we are not monarchists. I am not a monarchist. Hoppe is not a monarchist. That just comes from an argument that Hoppe put forth that a lot of European nations would be better off if they stuck with monarchy instead of getting into democracy. However, attempts to recreate those monarchies probably wouldn't go over too well because honestly, any attempt to create a centrally planned community in any way these days that uses coercion we'll probably end up trying to do communism, and that's just not going to work. That's kind of the basic problems of people who are post-libertarian NRXs. They want to turn back the clock to a time from before progressive ideologies existed, but you can't really do that. So I believe the march towards more privatization and voluntary type of societies would be better. And if we ever meet in person, maybe I'll give you a penny. Next question. Do you keep up at all with global geopolitics, have any interest in it? Yes, but not as much as I keep up with philosophy, or as much as I keep up with what academics are pushing. The main thing I don't like is that a lot of people who make content around it react to what is happening and don't really go into enough of why it is happening. Perhaps I'll do more videos on that in the future because yes, I do keep up with it a little bit. Especially the history of it, because if you understand the history of geopolitics, you can actually often predict what's going to happen next anyway. Next up is, do you think woke is a meaningful word to use in political discourse? Yes, as long as it's being used by someone who knows what it means. So an aggressive push for diversity, equity, and inclusion, usually based on the belief that a lack of these things indicates some kind of unfair practice. Usually this results in a disdain towards those who are considered to be in the majority, quote, group. And it is also very important that people need to understand that it actually is legally enshrined into US law. If you just look up disparate impact laws in United States government website, I believe the very first result, or maybe the second result, if you look it up on Google for disparate impact laws, will be the Department of Justice, and you read that thing, and it's basically far-left woke ideology enshrined into law. And people who talk about wokeness really need to understand this, because it needs to be universally understood by a lot more people than those who currently understand it, which is why I repeat this talking point so often, that this law needs to be abolished if you want any hope of progress. It should have been abolished a long time ago. It should have never existed, of course, but it should have also been abolished a very long time ago. No, seriously, everyone who is still listening to this, I strongly suggest, if you have not already, make a mental note to look up disparate impact laws on the Department of Justice's website. I'm pretty sure it's the second result on Google or something. You will be amazed at the absolute insanity of what this law says. Next up, Fumo's owned 3. Alright, next up. Okay, government can't do anything right, and his question is, what are the win conditions for government? The things that it does well, its least bad functions, in ways that are presumably more complex than just building roads and managing identities. So the simple way to understand this is that the government performing a necessary function of society is better than nobody performing that function. However, a more voluntary company will always do it better. That being said, some of the things that government can kind of do fairly well are things that you absolutely really do need, that are good for society as a whole, and are simple enough that it's almost impossible for them to be mired with corruption. So I guess one W for the government would have to be fire departments. However, it's actually been proven that a private community can do fire departments just fine as well. However, fire departments are handled relatively well in most first world countries. Next up, do you believe at all political ideologies can and often do obscure a truthful view of the world, or would you say your ideology and worldview are the correct ones? Well, everybody basically believes that their own ideology is the correct one, and people who believe they don't have an ideology actually do have one, they just haven't fully examined it yet. What I think the mature way of doing this is to remember to look at ideologies as a tier list rather than a my ideology correct, everyone else's ideology wrong. You have to think in terms of, does this move the world closer in terms of truth, and in terms of ethics, and in terms of making things better. This is why I earlier didn't poop too hard on Georgism, despite the fact that I don't agree with Georgism. Because Georgism is flawed, and I agree with Zulu's takes on Georgism, but I believe it is better than the current system, so I'm not going to smack it too hard. That's also a very mature mentality to have to avoid purity spiraling too hard. Anyway, next up, do you think, although with little chance if someone with libertarian or simply small government sentiments wins the 2024 presidential election, that we may be able to bounce back and restore freedom? Or do you think that it'll never happen and that revolts or full-on revolution is the only way? So no, violent revolution is not the way. Now, honestly, this is kind of a trick question in a way, and I'm not sure if you meant this, but if a libertarian actually wins the US presidential election, then the chances of restoring freedom are actually pretty darn good, because that would mean a very large people suddenly realize that socialism just isn't gonna work. Or in other words, if that situation were to happen, it means that BreadTube likely got BTFO over the last year or so. Because the most important thing you need to restore freedom is people who understand that you need to restore freedom. And once that is done, a lot of the other things just kind of fall into place. This is actually what the New Hampshire Freedom Project kind of understands. The realization that in order to create a free society, you need people who actually care about having a free society. But yeah, it's not totally over. There is hope. I do believe that a short-term, simple strategy is convincing Republicans to be more on the side of free market, because it is a lot easier to reason with them than it is to reason with left-leaning liberals these days. Next question. Oh wow, speak of the devil. So, about those neolibs, do you plan to discuss the ideas of more centrist neoliberal YouTubers? Two good choices are SFO's videos about Hayek or universal healthcare, and the Ohio Amtrak incident. So SFO has a lot of really good cultural takes, to the point where I don't think it's really worth refuting anything he really gets wrong unless he gets things really wrong. There's much, much crazier fish out there to fry. Except thoughts on Trump's mugshot helps Trump a lot more than it hurts him. I'm basically neutral towards Donald Trump, and I can definitely say the people who think that that makes him look bad are in a severe state of cope right now. Next up, do you prefer the name anarcho-capitalism or voluntarism? I like voluntarism more, but I actually prefer to use the word decentralization, because it explains what it is to normies better than anything else. Next up, what is your level of education? I dropped out of kindergarten. I am completely uneducated. Okay, no, seriously, bachelor's. I considered going further than that, but the thing is, I did tech. And anybody else who has done tech or gotten a degree in either IT or computer science, or done game design or any kind of other related study, you probably know that there's really no point in going beyond bachelor's, because what matters after that is more or less experience and connections, as well as certifications. Next up is opinion on Pinochet. Okay, just so you know, the Hoppian helicopter physical removal memes are just that, a meme. It's not actually what physical removal means. Why Tuhus? Because Zune is based. Favorite and least favorite president? Well, they all have problems, but Calvin Coolidge was pretty based. Still had flaws, but for the most part, as far as presidents go, not bad. Least favorite president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Next up, what flaws do you see on capitalism, like self-criticism? Okay, so there's really only one argument against free markets and voluntarism that you can kind of see as being correct. And that argument is very simple. People are stupid. There are people out there who are very, 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 very dumb and cannot make good decisions, even for themselves. And so they will make very stupid, very short-term, very bad time preference decisions, and basically screw themselves in a more voluntary society. Specifically the people with IQ 80 or below or so. The problem is that's not a good enough reason to subject everybody else to not having freedom. It's basically just collective guilt. For instance, one kid in the class is a moron and can't answer a question that everybody else can answer, so they're going to treat it like the entire class can't answer the question. The correct answer is that that one kid should be failed. And I know that may seem cruel because it can seem like you're basically sacrificing the idiots, but that's actually not true, because the thing is, free markets tend to improve the quality of life for everyone, so even the people who make bad decisions at the very bottom will still have a relatively decent quality of life. But yes, they will kind of struggle. And yeah, that is kind of valid criticism. And the reality is, some of them are just gonna not make it, but that's not a good reason to screw everybody else. Next up, oh yes, another one of those multi-questioners. I will go with 3. What's your take on the European migrant crisis? So yeah, what's going on in the European migrant crisis is basically the problem I believe I pointed out before, which is that the combination of welfare state plus open borders doesn't work. Because what happens is the people are incentivized to go there not to actually be a part of that community, but rather to take advantage of that community because they don't actually have freedom of association there. And so of course they never actually integrate. They never actually gain any respect for their host nation because they never had any respect for them to begin with. Drastically different and contradictory value systems end up clashing and never meshing. And basically you get clown world. I believe Angela Merkel of Germany even recently admitted that it has failed. So we even have people who are relatively on the left of things finally admitting that it's not working because it's kind of obvious that it's not working. Next up, worst economist you have ever seen. That would be economicist Richard Wolff. Next up, what is your opinion on communism, socialism being popularized by internet personalities, bread tubers, and how do you think we should counter their indoctrination of naive teens? So this is actually a harder one than it sounds because I'm constantly thinking of it all the time, because the thing that BreadTube does very well is they sell a very easy to understand ideology that also feels very good to believe in. It feels really good to think that you're fighting for some kind of equality and justice, and it feels really good to think that you're entitled to free stuff. It feels really good to just blame people who are more successful than you for your lack of success. I mean, you're just a justice warrior, and you have no accountability, and you're not responsible for anything. It feels really good. And that's what makes it so hard to deprogram them, because they've emotionally decided that it's true. I mean, it's basically a cult. And the answer I've found is that you just have to roast each of their bad arguments one by one. Specifically, starting with the more popular ones, because you can make an infinite amount of bad arguments for any subject. With the question of 1 + 1 = X, there are infinite amount of wrong answers. So when the wrong answers exist, you'll want to start with the most popular wrong answers. But as far as the most digestible and the one that's easiest to understand and one that can really be easily explained to a teenager would be incentives. The fact that I understood incentives from a very young age is what helped me get over that once I was no longer a preteen. I basically figured out praxeology for myself without ever even having to read about what praxeology is. And honestly, a lot of people can probably figure that one out. You accept the fact that man acts towards some kind of purposeful goal, and you accept the fact that men need incentives in order to act towards a purposeful goal that benefit them. Anybody who accepts that and starts pushing that to its logical conclusion will at the very least realize that socialism and communism cannot possibly work. Anyways, I think that's where I am going to end this. So yeah, didn't expect that to be my longest video ever made, but there you go. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that stuff. Till next time.